In the Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Maternal Mage build. This is a mage build using the new finger sorceries that are acquired in the DLC from doing Ymir's questline. And I've been rocking this build for the last day or so, and honestly, I think it's a fantastic build. It might be one of the better builds I've played so far. If you're struggling with the difficulty of the game, this could be a really good build for you because I find that a lot of bosses are made easier by having a ranged option. So first, let's get into the sorceries themselves. First is Glintstone Nail. This is kind of your typical ranged projectile. This does 100% magic damage, and it kind of tracks the target. So like if it goes past the target, it'll kind of come back and try and hit it. Doesn't have like superb tracking, but sometimes even when enemies are very agile, it can hit them. You can charge this up for extra damage, and it's good at just picking off individual targets, particularly before they know that you're there. So then Glintstone Nails is kind of a multiple projectile version of this, and something that you'll notice immediately is that the damage of it is only like 10 to 20% higher than Glintstone Nail itself. So you might be thinking, why would I use this spell when I can just use the other one? It's more cost effective, and there is a reason for it, which is stance damage. This will give you more stance damage as each nail hits the target. You can stance break a little bit easier, so keep that in mind. And also, you are still going to get more damage per cast, and sometimes when you're fighting bosses, it's about how fast can you deal damage rather than, how much FP you're spending. But, as you're exploring out on the landscape and you're going into dungeons and stuff like that, probably better to use Glintstone Nail than Glintstone Nails for just weak targets. And then we come to Fleeting Microcosm, and this is a phenomenal spell that sort of summons an orb under the feet of a target or casts it a good ways out if there is no target. And it does a little bit of damage initially when it kind of like comes out of the ground, and then the orb will come up and then explode after a couple seconds in a huge AoE dealing damage. And this thing also does 100% magic damage just like the other two spells. It's chargeable just like the other two spells for increased damage. And this thing slaps so hard. If you want to go clear encampments, you're tired of those guys hitting like a truck, the Mesmer soldiers or whatever, just slap this thing on, get behind it, just kind of approach slowly, cast this before they even know you're there, and you can wipe out 3-4 dudes at a time, and anything that survives you just hit with a follow-up. And if you're fighting like Black Knights or any of the other harder elite enemies, if you can get the drop on them and get a charged one of these off, it usually knocks them down. And then while they're down, you can be, as soon as you end casting, you begin casting the next, and when they get up, they get knocked down again by the next one. You can just chain them. And it's really, really deadly. Works well in boss fights because it's hard for bosses to evade the AoE explosion. The only time that it's, maybe not so good in boss fights is with very mobile targets, like maybe Tree Sentinels or R'Lana. It can be kind of difficult to land it. But even then, there are times when you're fighting R'Lana where she stands still and you can get her. And if you use this from close up, like if you anticipate them coming towards you, wait till they get close and you use it, and you kind of roll into it, you can keep bosses in the explosion anyway. So you can find ways to use it at close range, but it works best at longer ranges. And then we have the Cherished Fingers spell. This is kind of a weird one. This one deals 100% physical damage and doesn't deal magic damage, unlike the other three spells. And it does sort of an AoE around you that does decent damage. You can charge it up for extra damage as well. And it also wards off projectiles, but the fingers have to be around you in order for the projectiles to be warded off, meaning like you can't be mid-casting it. Like the fingers have to have come out of the ground and be around you. So the very tail end of this spell that blocks projectiles, it can be hard to use to block projectiles, but there are fights like maybe the R'Lana fight where you want to block a bunch of waves of magic, and it can be useful in those moments. But I find it works best for aggressive enemies that are like on top of you, or and also enemies that are, resistant heavily to magic damage that are aggressive. You can cast this instead. And like in the R'Lana fight, for instance, she dodges all over the place. So even if she gets behind you, this spell will hit behind you. So there are cases for it, and you should definitely keep it slotted for those cases. So let's talk about the equipment we're using for this build next. I have the Carrion Regal Scepter in my main hand for casting, and that's because, out of all the staffs that can cast, this one is just like such a staple. At 80 intelligence, it has fantastic scaling or sorcery scaling. And even though there are ones with higher, they come with drawbacks like increased FP cost, or if you're using something like the Prince of Death staff, you have to have very high int and faith to surpass the scaling of this. And I just don't have the attribute points at this point. And this is the exact reason that I don't have the Maternal staff, which you'll see in my offhand as my main staff for this build. It actually reaches 414 sorcery scaling at 80 intelligence and 80 arcane, which is better than this staff's sorcery scaling. but I'd have to dump 70 points in Arcane in order to get there, or I'd have to dump 40 points or something like that in order to come close to what I have now. So I'm putting it there in my offhand because it boosts Finger Sorcery damage by 15%. So we're getting that passive buff in the offhand and then casting with the Kyrian Regal Scepter. Now, if you had higher stats and you were playing an Arcane build, like maybe you were like a 200 level character or 250, you could absolutely just cast with the Maternal Staff, and there's going to be a point when it surpasses it. But just to give you an idea, at 50 intelligence and 50 arcane, you have 280 sorcery scaling. That's pretty bad for the amount of stat investment. That's 100 points invested to get 280, and with Kyrian Regal Scepter, you need 80 points to get 373. So that's why I'm using it, but I'm using it, the other one in my offhand, for the passive buff. So then for my helmet, I have the High Priest hat. This is just for fashion mostly. It does give you 1 intelligence and 1 arcane. So if you were, using the Maternal Staff, this would be good to use, but I'm just using it mostly for fashion here. And then I'm using the Finger Robe on my body. The Finger Robe passively gives you an 8% damage increase approximately to Finger Sorcery damage. So that's another boost to Finger Sorceries. The way you get this is by altering the High Priest Robe at a Site of Grace and turning it into this. So make sure you do that to get that extra damage. And then for my gloves and legs, I actually have the Bull Goats set equipped here, and that's to give me 53 poise. And the thing is with this armor, you can't see really what's under it. You can see what's on your hands, so if you want to prioritize some other armor on your hands that looks better and still maintain 51 poise, you can. But you can't really see the legs, so I figured why not slap something on there with good protection and good poise so we don't get interrupted as much when we're casting spells and we have better protection. You still basically have the same look as if you were using the High Priest set with the Finger Robe anyway. You, of course, can use whatever you want, but I highly recommend using the Finger Robe for the passive benefit. So when it comes to talismans, there's a lot that work really well for this build. First is another new one, which is Crusade Insignia, and this increases your attack power by 15% for 20 seconds after you kill an enemy. And this includes enemies that just die randomly on the landscape. But this is going to increase the power of your spells significantly after you kill one target, and it refreshes for each one you kill. So this really helps to crank out damage when you're exploring on the landscape. Not so good in boss fights because most bosses don't have ads, so you want to swap it out there. Blessed Blue Dew Talisman is also fantastic for exploration because it just passively recharges your FP at 1 every 2 seconds, which might seem like a little bit, but if you're running around just exploring on the landscape for 60 seconds, you're going to get 30 FP from that. So that's pretty good right there. That's enough to cast 2 or 3 casts. And it's just a good way to make playing a mage easier while you're out on the landscape. It's not an absolute must by any means, and in boss fights you might want to consider swapping it out, although I do find that it does help. There's also the Magic Scorpion Charm, which boosts your magic damage by 12%, but you will take more damage, so there is a trade-off there. And note that this doesn't apply to Cherishing Fingers because it deals physical damage, so if you find yourself using that spell a lot, then you probably wouldn't use this. This is probably one that, unless you know a fight, like a boss fight that you're doing, I wouldn't recommend because it is going to boost the damage that you take. There's also Graven Mass Talisman, which increases the potency of sorceries by 8%, so you get 8% more damage there. This is a little bit better than Magic Scorpion Charm if you're using Cherishing Fingers, because it'll apply to that as well, and it doesn't have the drawback, so you might want to consider using this one over that one if you're trying to fill out one last slot. All 4 of these spells can be charged, so Godfrey Icon is a good choice here. I like using that a lot in this build. I feel like it's really good for FP management when you're just charging spells out on the landscape or in boss fights trying to get the most damage per spell. Can't always charge in boss fights, obviously, because bosses are aggressive, but there are cases where you can, and when you do, you get a lot more damage out of it, so I like having this one slotted. And then lastly, Ritual Sword Talisman is kind of, the staple for old mage builds. Increases your damage by 10% when you're at full health. I feel like this one is a little bit antiquated at this point because when you're out at an exploration, Crusade Insignia is better, and because bosses are so hard in this game, and when you're learning them, you're going to take damage. It's not going to play too much of a role in boss fights. Probably be better off going with some of the other ones here, but nonetheless, you can use that one as well if you don't have some of these yet. Attribute-wise, I have 50 Vigor, 40 Mind, 25 Endurance, 8 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 81 Intelligence, 7 Faith, and 10 Arcane. You don't need any Strength, Faith, or Arcane for this build. 81 Intelligence because of the helmet I'm using, otherwise it would be 80. That's going to get you the most damage out of your Kyrian Regal Scepter. The Kyrian Regal Scepter is not even worth using unless you have about 70 Intelligence anyway. And at some point, if you want to get more damage out of this build, you'll probably, either crank Arcane and do something like 60, 60, 70, 70 like that, Arcane Intelligence, and then take that up to 80 obviously to get more sorcery scaling. But that's a huge stat investment in order to do, so it would be some time before you would switch over. So you'd be better off, leveling up like Vigor to 60 or 55, Mind higher, Endurance higher, etc., Intelligence even higher, in the meantime, till you have the levels that you can go respec into Arcane Intelligence. So for Vigor, 50 is kind of the staple I have. We do have decent protection here, and you can take this up to 55 or 60 if you want, but I wouldn't go higher than that. 40 Mind is just to have lots of FP, so we don't have to flask often during boss fights. You can take this up to like 50 if you want to get even more FP. Probably not a bad idea if you're going to go higher levels into this build. And for Flask of Wonders Physique, I have the Opaline Hard tier for more protection and Magic Shroud and Crack tier for more magic damage. Even though this isn't going to boost the damage of Cherishing Fingers, the other 3 spells I use probably way more often, so you're going to get a significant boost to damage using that. You could also use Terra Magica in this build, by the way, even though it was nerfed a little bit, to gain even more magic damage if you find yourself staying put in fights. That is also an option. And then when it comes to Great Runes, my recommendation would be to use Radahn's here, because it's going to give you health, FP, and stamina. FP is good because you're a mage, health's good, stamina's good, all those things are good. So you could easily go with that and be, very well off. So that wraps up the Maternal Mage build. I hope you guys found this one interesting. I really, really enjoy these spells, and frankly, I find this build to be probably one of the better ones I've made so far in terms of making bosses less difficult. I know that that's a kind of hot topic right now, so if you find yourself struggling, consider doing this one. You can get the first 2 spells, I think, just from buying them from the NPC in the Cathedral from Ymir, and then the second one that you get, which I think is kind of the bread and butter of this build, you have to find the second bell and sound it, which can take a little bit to do, but really, you don't have to kill any bosses in order to get those first 3 spells. If you want Cherishing Finger and you want the Maternal Staff and Finger Robe, you'll have to kill 1 boss, but otherwise you can get almost all the stuff in this build from just killing 0 bosses, which is great. As always, if you have questions or tips, please leave them in the comments, and if there is a build you guys want to see, also leave that in the comments. I read that, kind of helps direct future builds, and I will try and keep those in mind when deciding which builds to do next.